I'm always on the search for amazing watches for me. All these watches that I show on this channel are generally my watches, and they're watches that I've really thought about a lot. And I'm very careful about which ones I choose because I've only got a certain amount of money to spend on watches. So when I made that decision to sort of really look more into Omega and maybe even consider buying one, I really looked deep into their back catalogue, their current catalogue, and I ended up with a rather interesting Omega. How are you watching, James? My name's James, you're watching me, and I'm talking about watches. I'm talking about the first ever Omega in my collection. It may well be the last ever Omega in my collection, I'm not quite sure, but I have to say this one has ended up being the right Omega for me because I really like it. It is the Omega Dynamic Chronograph. Now this is not a current model watch from Omega. Far from it. This watch is almost 20 years old and perhaps even a little bit older. But I was lucky enough to find this one online, see it, watch a few reviews about it, and then sort of understand that this one might be the one for me. And if you haven't seen this one before, well, it is worthwhile checking out because it is a beautiful looking watch. And because it is getting a little bit older, it tends to be a little bit more affordable than some of the current Omegas. Now, I paid around $2,500 Australian dollars for this one on Chrono24, which for me is a lot of money on a watch. And I understand that is a lot of money on a watch, but I think this watch might be something rather special. And I've been enjoying owning this one for the last few months. And I really want to share my experiences with you about this watch because I don't think there is enough information online about it. There certainly isn't enough reviews about it in the detail that I particularly like to see when I'm considering buying a watch. So today, let me show you those details of this Omega Dynamic Chronograph. There are so many different Omegas out there on the market. They've been a company that's been going for a long time. They have some really great styles of watches, some really interesting watches. But I have to admit, I probably struggle to find one that I absolutely love. There's lots that I like, but to actually spend money on them and go, I want that watch, that's a next step for me. And it wasn't until I found this Dynamic Chronograph that I absolutely needed to have an Omega in my collection. I've always really enjoyed the brand. I've always liked the brand, but this one really stood out to me. And being a used watch, being around 20 years old, it then meant that I was actually able to afford it. Not that it was particularly cheap. Being a second-hand watch, I'm expecting and hoping for it to be a little bit cheaper, but being an Omega, it's going to obviously retain some of its value, and that is going to then make it a more expensive watch. And at the time of purchasing this one, it was the most expensive watch I have ever bought. And I bought it for a few reasons. Partly because I absolutely love the look of it. That is a big part of it. But I also know that it being an Omega is part of that decision. I wanted to own an Omega. I've tried very hard not to allow that to be a part of my decision-making process when I buy a watch. But because I love the look of this one so much as well, then I allowed that sort of extra little bit to add into it. But it was also the dimensions of this watch because it's a really nice set of dimensions. The case itself is 38.2 millimeters. It is 12.7 millimeters wide, has a nice compact 45 millimeter lug to lug, has a 20 millimeter lug width, but it does taper down to 15.8 down at the clasp, and it weighs 125 grams. So it ends up sitting really nicely on wrist from a weight and size perspective, especially for my medium 6 3/4 or around about 17 centimeters wrist. But it is definitely the looks of this one that has continued to capture my attention. Now, besides the matte black dial, which is really nice, everything else on there is printed. But what I like is that they've used a couple of colors. We get a nice stark white on the logo, on the main numbers, on the dynamic, on the automatic, on that railway track that's running around the outside, as well as Swiss made down there just below the 6. But of course, we can see that big pop of color in regards to yellow. Nice big yellow chronograph hand, which we'll get started now just to see some more movement on this one. But there's also a yellow hand on the timer itself, plus around that railway track in the 10, 15, 20, etc. around there, which I think is really, really cool. Being a chronograph, obviously there's 2 subdials, but what I do like about this one is that it has a running second hand at the 3 o'clock. It is nice to have movement on a chronograph, and I don't always want my chronograph movement running, the actual chronograph feature, so it's nice to have movement on the dial. I do really like the color that they've used on that sort of counter, that 30-minute timer. And there's also some segmented up to about 10 minutes. And I believe from my understanding, there is a bit of a throwback to a historic thing when it comes to telephone calls or something like that. All I can say is that I think it looks absolutely fantastic. It is all covered by a piece of flat sapphire crystal with lots of AR coating, which is good because the legibility of this watch is fantastic. It's obviously a pilot style watch, so it has some really strong white hands, and it also has some great lume. This watch being 20 years old, however in amazing condition as you can see, the lume has held up really well and has been quite impressive. So check this lume out, and I really like it. But when we look beyond that dial, we're going to see that the solid bezel there is brushed, the case is brushed, the bracelet is brushed, the clasp is brushed. Yes, okay, the whole thing is brushed, which gives it a really sort of simple look, but the brushing is done so well that it really gives it an almost elegant look, and that partly probably comes because of the size as well. Obviously, we've got the chronograph pushers. It is a fly black or a quick set chronograph, something like that. So when we hit that, it flicks back, and it obviously resets that timer as well. When we turn it onto the side, we can see that we have a signed crown there with the Omega symbol, which is very nice. But you can see those pushers and the crown are offset slightly. That is because this watch contains a caliber 1138, which is my understanding it is an ETA-based caliber with a module on it, and that module allows it to be a chronograph. But because it has a module, it then affects how the pushers and the crown sit, hence why they are offset. It is a sort of normal 3-hand movement with a module turning it into a chronograph. Now this watch only has 50 meters of water resistance, which makes it rather weird that then it has a screw down crown. It does have that sort of ETA based movement, which means it does have hand winding. And because this watch does not have a date function, it doesn't have a ghost position either, which is nice. So it clicks straight out to the first position, which also hacks that second hand there, which you can't see because it's under that minute hand. But I'm always interested to see how movements are performing. And being a 20-year watch that hasn't been serviced, that basically hasn't been worn before I purchased it, it'll be quite interesting to see how this one is. So let's stick it on the time grapher. So for a 20-year-old watch that hasn't been serviced and hasn't been worn much, I'm actually okay with those figures. Yes, it's running around about minus 20 seconds a day, and the amplitude's a little bit low, but the beat error is basically sitting at 0, which is fantastic, and you can see it is a high beat 28,800 vibrations movement. So now we come to the bracelet, which I absolutely love, but I absolutely hate. I absolutely love because it is really well made. Solid end links, of course it's a solid milled bracelet there, 5 links. It looks absolutely fantastic, lots of nice movement, but the problem with it is it captures my arm hairs. Now I do have a lot of arm hairs, I admit, but even when I've cut my arm hairs to allow myself to wear this watch better, it still grabs my arm hairs, more than any watch that I have experienced, which is a little bit of a shame. It has made the sort of wearing of this watch a little bit uncomfortable. I do like the clasp, however. It is stamped with Omega, lots of micro adjust. It is just a friction clasp. It is also not milled, unfortunately, pressed being a watch this age, and a nice simple case back with the Omega logo. On wrist, it has an amazing weight to it, amazing sort of feel to it. I think it sits really nicely, not too thick. You know, it is a chronograph, so it's going to be a little bit thicker than other watches, but I think it looks actually really good. But as I mentioned, unfortunately, this does grab my sort of wrist hairs a little bit, which has taken the sort of experience of this watch down a couple of pegs, which is a little bit unfortunate because I bought this watch because I really wanted it on the bracelet. This was a big part of my buying decision because I think it looks fantastic, because I know putting this watch on a nice leather strap would fix this problem completely. But that is not what I wanted from this watch specifically. I think it looks really nice with the bracelet. So it has been a little bit of a negative about this watch for me. So what do I like about this watch? What don't I like about it? And what would I change? So of course I absolutely love the look of this one. I think the colors on the dial are fantastic. I think the look of the watch is fantastic. The quality of the watch is outstanding, and I love the look of this bracelet. It's just unfortunate because it does rip the hairs off my wrist, so I do not like that. I don't particularly like a press clasp, but for a watch this age, it doesn't bother me, and it is actually a very comfortable and nice fitting clasp, so that doesn't bother me whatsoever. So the only thing that I really would change about this one is to make the bracelet sort of not grab my hairs. But if I was going to be completely picky, although I really like the size of this watch, although I think it actually suits my wrist, I would probably increase it just a fraction, turning this from like a 38mm to a 39, because I have a few 38s and a few 39s in my collection, and 39 seems to be a slightly nicer sweet spot, especially for a pilot style watch. Hasn't taken away from the fact that I love this watch, however, but the bracelet unfortunately has. And as a result of that bracelet, it means I haven't ended up wearing this watch as much as I would like to, which is a little bit of a shame because I definitely bought this watch to be a permanent part of my collection, but I'm still starting to see whether I can wear it in a little bit, and I may end up giving in and sticking it on a strap. But I hope you enjoyed this review. I hope you enjoyed something a little bit different from Omega and from me, and if you enjoyed this video, maybe you'll like these videos next.